Travelers from Singapore will now have to serve quarantine if they're going to Denmark. Denmark, if you recall, is on our vaccinated travel lane scheme. Well, this comes after the European Union removed Singapore from a list of countries where travelers are exempt from EU travel restrictions. Posting on Facebook, the Embassy of Denmark in Singapore said Singapore was, quote, now considered a high-risk country for travel to Europe. With the exception of certain groups like Danish citizens, all travelers from Singapore must be tested upon arrival and self-isolate for 10 days. If a negative PCR test result is produced, the quarantine will end on the 4th day. Let's discuss this with journalist Toh Ting Wei. Ting Wei, why was Singapore removed from the European list? Why was it, reclassified? Why is Singapore seen as a high-risk country despite having 85% of our eligible population fully vaccinated?
Yeah, so the timing of this came as a bit of a surprise to me personally because the list has been updated every 2 weeks. And as we would know for the cases in Singapore, it has been improving in the past 2 weeks. Before that, maybe 1 month before this, and in the last 6 weeks before this, I think the cases were rising. We hit a record high of number of cases and such. So during that point, at the last review on October 28th, the EU Council has still deemed Singapore to be a safe country in terms of whether to lift border restrictions or not. So on the review that was announced this Tuesday, Singapore disappeared from the list for countries which border restrictions should be lifted. So regarding the specific details, they don't really announce which criteria that Singapore or any other country for that matter has breached when they are removed off the list. But based off their website, there's kind of a general set of criteria to show what they consider when determining whether countries should be on the list or off. So one example is how there should be not more than 75 new COVID cases per 100,000 people in that country over the last 14 days. Or another one is having a stable or a decreasing trend of new cases, like in these 14 days compared to the previous 14 days. So there are also other requirements like how many tests the country conducts, the vaccination rate and such. So even though Singapore does have a high vaccination rate, one of the highest in the world, I think the other factors that EU consider might have weighed it down. But looking at the timing of the announcement, I suspect it might be a case of them looking at maybe kind of a more dated set of data, maybe like 1 month before or something like that. So it could well be possible that Singapore might be added onto the list again in a matter of a month or so. But then again, that's quite speculative. So we can only wait to see what the EU Council announces in its subsequent reviews 2 weeks from now.
I see. Then Ting Wei, what is the impact of this development on the 8 vaccinated travel lanes that Singapore already has with EU member states?
Yeah, so for the impact on the vaccinated travel lanes, there won't be any impact on the vaccinated travel lane itself per se, because vaccinated travel lanes are unilateral moves by Singapore generally, as with the EU countries. So when Singapore announced and started vaccinated travel lanes with the European countries, there are 10 in total now, 8 of them are in the EU. It was a unilateral move. These countries, all of these 10 countries, they were already open to Singapore, and then Singapore announced the vaccinated travel lanes with them. So for the lanes itself, I don't think it might have an impact immediately as long as the cases in these countries don't spike too much. But in terms of general two-way quarantine-free travel, there will definitely be an impact. Because what the VTLs do is they give Singapore residents a way to come back into Singapore without quarantine. But to go to the other countries, you kind of need them to open up to you as well to enjoy quarantine-free travel. So for example, in the case of Denmark, they have announced, the embassy has announced today that Singapore will now be classified as a high-risk country. And I'm guessing that they took reference from the EU's recommendation. So with Singapore being classified as a high-risk country in terms of COVID-19 infection risk, it means that a Singapore resident flying over to Denmark will now have to be quarantined for 10 days, regardless of whether you are vaccinated or not, because they don't recognize Singapore's vaccination certificate at the moment yet. But this 10-day quarantine at least can be shortened to 4 days if you take you have the option to take a PCR test on the fourth day, and if you are negative, your quarantine period will be shortened. So quarantine is one way in which the kind of like your travel journey can be affected if you are traveling to these European countries. And other kind of ways in which you could be like a traveler going there could be affected would be in terms of maybe having to have a additional testing requirement. Like for the Netherlands now, from Saturday they'll require Singaporeans going there to be able to like test negative in a pre-departure test before flying over. And there could also be additional like maybe registration for contact tracing. I think for Germany, there's already some new requirement as well for some kind of forms that Singaporeans, like Singapore residents, will need to fill. And lastly, there could also be some more additional requirements in terms of vaccination. Because for Germany as well, if I remember correctly, for Sinovac, it might not be recognized by them at the moment. So with Singapore being deemed as a higher risk country, I think like it might affect those taking vaccines that are like Sinovac or Sinopharm, which are not as recognized in Europe.